When Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic in 1492, he did not sail for Italy. He sailed for Spain. That single fact reveals something crucial about the political reality of Europe at the dawn of the Age of Exploration. At the very moment when kingdoms were beginning to expand across oceans, Italy did not exist as a unified nation. There was no Kingdom of Italy, no national navy, no centralized treasury capable of financing long-distance voyages. Instead, the Italian peninsula was divided into a collection of powerful, independent, and often rival states. The land we now call Italy was a patchwork of political entities: Venice, Genoa, Florence, Milan, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples. Each operated as its own world. They minted their own coins, commanded their own armies, negotiated their own treaties, and pursued their own economic ambitions. These states were wealthy and sophisticated. Venice dominated Eastern Mediterranean trade. Genoa was a maritime powerhouse with extensive commercial networks. Florence thrived as a center of banking and Renaissance culture. Milan focused on military strength and territorial control in northern Italy. The Papal States governed central Italy under the authority of the Pope, blending spiritual power with political rule. The Kingdom of Naples controlled the southern portion of the peninsula. Yet despite their wealth and influence, these states lacked unity. There was no single monarch who could command the combined resources of the entire peninsula. If Venice wanted to explore westward, it acted independently. If Genoa wished to fund an expedition, it did so alone. Cooperation was rare because rivalry was constant. Competition defined their relationships. Venice and Genoa, for example, fought bitter wars for control of Mediterranean trade routes. Political alliances shifted frequently. Trust between states was fragile. This fragmentation made large-scale overseas expansion extraordinarily difficult. While Italy remained divided, Spain was consolidating power. The marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile united two major Iberian kingdoms. By 1492, Spain had completed the Reconquista, driving Muslim rule from Granada and strengthening royal authority. The Spanish monarchy could collect taxes from vast territories, coordinate military campaigns, and invest in ambitious maritime projects. Portugal, too, had long been unified under a strong crown and had spent decades developing Atlantic navigation techniques. These kingdoms could pool national wealth and take risks that smaller states could not. The difference between unified monarchies and divided city-states was decisive. Overseas exploration required enormous resources. Ships had to be built, crews had to be paid, supplies had to be stocked for months at sea. Investors needed confidence that the crown could protect trade routes and defend new territories. A centralized government could spread risk across an entire nation. A single city-state could not easily absorb the financial loss of a failed expedition. This political fragmentation also shaped the decisions of explorers themselves. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, one of the great maritime cities of Italy. Yet Genoa did not sponsor his westward proposal. The reasons were practical. Genoa's commercial focus remained firmly planted in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Its leaders saw little need to gamble on an uncertain Atlantic route when established trade networks already generated profit. Without a unified Italian state to back him, Columbus sought funding elsewhere. Eventually, Spain agreed to sponsor his voyage. When he reached the Caribbean in 1492, he claimed the lands not for Genoa, not for Italy, but for the Spanish crown. Columbus was not alone. John Cabot, born Giovanni Caboto in Italy, sailed under the English flag. Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian navigator, worked for Spain and Portugal. The irony is striking. Italian sailors helped shape the discovery and mapping of the Americas, yet they did so in service of foreign powers. Their homeland lacked the political unity necessary to support their ambitions. Division did more than prevent expansion. It invited foreign intervention. Beginning in 1494, the Italian peninsula became the battleground for major European powers in what are known as the Italian Wars. France invaded, claiming rights to Naples and Milan. Spain countered. The Holy Roman Empire intervened. For decades, Italy was a chessboard on which larger monarchies moved their pieces. Cities were besieged, alliances were formed and broken. Resources were drained into defensive warfare rather than overseas exploration. Instead of sending fleets across the Atlantic, Italian states were fortifying walls and raising armies. Instead of financing colonies, they were paying mercenaries. Political instability discouraged long-term imperial planning. Investors preferred stable returns from banking and Mediterranean trade over risky ventures into unknown oceans. The cost of disunity became painfully clear. While other European powers expanded outward, Italy struggled simply to maintain control over its own territory. National identity also played a subtle but important role. Colonization was not merely an economic enterprise, it was a statement of national power and prestige. Spain planted its flag in the New World as a symbol of Spanish authority. Portugal claimed Brazil in the name of the Portuguese crown. England would later establish colonies that carried English law and identity across the Atlantic. But in the late 15th century, there was no shared Italian national identity strong enough to inspire collective expansion. A Venetian colony would not necessarily benefit Florence. A Genoese colony would not strengthen Milan. Without unity of purpose, there was no unified imperial vision. Meanwhile, the Renaissance flourished across Italian cities. Florence invested in art, scholarship, and architecture. Rome focused on religious authority and grand construction. Venice maintained its maritime dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. These priorities reflected confidence in existing economic systems. The Mediterranean had long been the center of European trade. Many Italian leaders did not yet see the Atlantic as the future of global commerce. By the time the shift became undeniable, Spain and Portugal had already secured vast territories. Italy would not achieve national unification until 1861, more than 3 centuries after Columbus's voyage. Figures such as Giuseppe Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel II helped forge a single Italian kingdom during the Risorgimento. But by then, the colonial map of the Americas was firmly established. Spain controlled much of Central and South America. Portugal ruled Brazil. Britain and France had carved out territories in North America and the Caribbean. The window of opportunity had long closed. The story of why Italy did not colonize the Americas is not a story of weakness or lack of talent. It is a story of timing and political structure. Italy produced skilled sailors, brilliant navigators, and innovative thinkers. What it lacked was unity. In the age when empire required coordinated national effort, fragmentation proved decisive. Spain had structure, Portugal had cohesion, Italy had brilliance divided among competing states. History often turns on organization as much as ambition. In 1492, the Italian peninsula possessed knowledge, maritime experience, and entrepreneurial energy. But without a unified nation to harness those strengths, it could not compete in the race for overseas empire. The absence of a single Italian state at the dawn of the Age of Exploration shaped not only Italy's future, but the future of the Americas as well. If the absence of unity was Italy's greatest structural weakness, rivalry was its greatest internal obstacle. In the late 15th century, the Italian peninsula was not merely divided, it was competitive, strategic, and often hostile within itself. The major powers of the region did not see themselves as pieces of a larger Italian identity. They saw themselves as independent republics, duchies, kingdoms, and religious states fighting for dominance, influence, and survival. 2 of the most powerful maritime states were Venice and Genoa. Both were wealthy. Both were experienced seafaring powers. Both commanded advanced fleets. And both had centuries of commercial expertise. But instead of cooperating to explore the Atlantic, they fought each other. Venice controlled trade routes in the eastern Mediterranean. It dominated commerce with the Byzantine Empire and later with the Ottoman world. Its wealth flowed from spices, silk, and goods transported through established networks. Genoa, located on the western coast, competed fiercely for maritime contracts and trading privileges. The 2 republics had already fought multiple naval wars long before Columbus was born. Their rivalry was not symbolic, it was violent. Battles for trade, supremacy shaped their policies. Trust between them was nearly non-existent. Cooperation on a massive Atlantic expedition would have required shared investment, shared risk, and shared reward. That level of coordination was politically unrealistic. While Venice focused on its eastern trade empire, Genoa invested in Mediterranean commerce and financial ventures across Europe. Neither state wanted to divert ships and resources toward a risky western gamble when immediate profits were available closer to home. Florence, meanwhile, was not primarily a maritime power at all. It was a financial and cultural giant. Banking families such as the Medici built vast financial networks across Europe. Florence influenced monarchies through loans and economic leverage rather than through naval expansion. Investing in art, architecture, and scholarship enhanced prestige without the dangers of transatlantic voyages. Milan's strength lay in land power. It maintained formidable armies and fortified cities. Its strategic concern was territorial defense and expansion within northern Italy. Atlantic exploration offered little immediate advantage to a duchy focused on regional land dominance. The Papal States governed central Italy under the Pope's authority. Their political calculations revolved around church influence, diplomacy, and maintaining balance among European powers. The papacy often played mediator between rival states. Launching a massive colonial enterprise would have risked upsetting delicate political relationships. The Kingdom of Naples in the south had its own dynastic struggles and foreign pressures. It was often influenced or controlled by larger European monarchies, particularly France and Spain. Stability, not expansion, was its priority. In this environment, every state guarded its interests carefully. Collaboration required trust. Trust required shared identity. And shared identity was weak. Contrast this with Spain. After the union of Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain operated as a single political entity. Resources from Castile and Aragon could be combined. Military victories strengthened central authority. When Columbus presented his proposal, the Spanish crown evaluated it as a national investment. If successful, the benefits would strengthen Spain as a whole. In Italy, success for one state might threaten another. If Venice sponsored a Western expedition and gained immense wealth, it could tilt the balance of power on the peninsula. Genoa would not welcome that outcome. Florence would calculate its own advantage. Milan might fear economic imbalance. This competitive mindset discouraged collective ambition. Rivalries also shaped foreign alliances. Italian states frequently aligned with outside powers against their neighbors. Venice sometimes allied with France. Milan might seek support from the Holy Roman Empire. The papacy shifted alliances to maintain influence. These shifting partnerships deepened internal divisions. When foreign powers invaded Italy, beginning in 1494, these rivalries worsened the crisis. Some states invited foreign armies to weaken their neighbors. The long-term consequence was loss of autonomy. Instead of uniting against external threats, Italian states maneuvered for short-term advantage. This pattern of rivalry had economic consequences as well. Wealth was invested in fortifications, mercenaries, and political maneuvering. The famous condottieri mercenary captains were hired to defend or attack rival states. Maintaining these forces consumed enormous funds. Money that could have financed exploration was instead spent on internal conflict. Even maritime strategy reflected rivalry rather than cooperation. Venice's fleet was designed to protect eastern trade routes. Genoa's ships defended western Mediterranean commerce. Neither was configured for sustained Atlantic colonization campaigns. Strategic planning focused on defending trade monopolies, not building new empires across unknown oceans. Psychologically, rivalry shaped ambition. Leaders prioritized immediate regional dominance over distant opportunity. Securing influence in northern Italy or control over Adriatic trade felt more tangible than an uncertain western voyage. The Atlantic was unknown and speculative. Rival states next door were immediate and real. This competitive culture also influenced explorers themselves. An ambitious navigator from Genoa might not expect Venice to support him. A Venetian captain would not naturally turn to Florence for funding. Political fragmentation limited the network of potential patrons. When explorers sought sponsors, foreign monarchies appeared more stable and more capable of delivering large-scale backing. Thus, Italian talent flowed outward. Columbus went to Spain. John Cabot went to England. Amerigo Vespucci served Iberian crowns. Their homeland provided skills and training, but foreign kingdoms provided structure and unity. By the time Italian leaders began recognizing the Atlantic's economic importance, Spain and Portugal had already secured vast claims. The Treaty of Tordesillas divided newly discovered lands between those two powers. Italy was not consulted as a unified entity because it did not exist as one. Rivalry had consumed opportunity. It is important to understand that Italian city-states were not backward or incapable. On the contrary, they were among the most advanced societies in Europe. Their banks financed kings. Their ships transported luxury goods. Their artists transformed Western culture. Their universities nurtured scholarship, but their energy was divided. Imagine a group of brilliant entrepreneurs competing fiercely in the same small market, while a neighboring unified corporation expands globally. Talent alone does not guarantee expansion. Coordination does. In the age of exploration, unity amplified power. Fragmentation diluted it. The Italian peninsula had wealth, intelligence, maritime experience, and strategic ports, yet internal competition prevented collective action. Rivalry preserved local strength, but undermined global ambition. History often rewards those who can act together at decisive moments. In the late 15th century, the decisive moment arrived with Atlantic exploration. Spain and Portugal acted as unified kingdoms. Italy acted as divided states. And in that difference, the future of empires was shaped. By the time Italian city-states were debating trade strategies and defending regional interests, two kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula had already positioned themselves for something much larger. Spain and Portugal did not simply explore the Atlantic by accident. They were structurally prepared for it. Their advantage began with unity. Portugal had been politically unified since the 12th century. Unlike the fragmented Italian peninsula, Portugal operated under a single crown with a clear national direction. For decades before Columbus, Portuguese rulers invested deliberately in maritime expansion. Under the influence of Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century, Portugal funded voyages down the west coast of Africa. Each expedition gathered knowledge about winds, currents, navigation, and shipbuilding. This was not random exploration. It was systematic state policy. Portuguese sailors gradually pushed farther south along Africa's coastline, seeking a direct sea route to Asia that would bypass Middle Eastern intermediaries. They improved ship design, especially the development of the caravel, a vessel capable of sailing long distances and handling Atlantic winds. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa. A decade later, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea. Portugal had built experience, confidence, and infrastructure before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. Spain's advantage came slightly later, but just as decisively. In 1469, the marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile united two powerful Spanish kingdoms. Though not immediately a perfectly centralized state, this union created a coordinated monarchy capable of long-term strategic planning. In 1492, Spain completed the Reconquista by capturing Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. This victory unified Spanish territory under Christian rule and strengthened royal authority. With internal conflict largely resolved, Spain could redirect military energy outward. This timing was crucial. When Christopher Columbus presented his westward proposal, Spain had both the resources and the motivation to consider it. The monarchy was seeking new opportunities for trade, wealth, and religious expansion. Supporting Columbus aligned with national goals. Unlike Italy's divided states, Spain could mobilize as one. The head start of Spain and Portugal was not just political, it was psychological. Both kingdoms viewed expansion as a national mission. Exploration was tied to religious purpose, economic ambition, and royal prestige. Converting non-Christians, expanding Christian influence, and gaining access to Asian wealth were intertwined objectives. Italy's city-states, by contrast, operated within narrower frameworks. Venice sought commercial advantage in existing markets. Florence pursued financial dominance. Milan focused on regional power. None were thinking in terms of building global empires under a shared identity. Spain and Portugal also benefited from geography. Both countries faced the Atlantic Ocean directly. Their ports opened naturally toward westward and southward voyages. Atlantic currents and wind systems became familiar to their sailors. Over time, they mastered the patterns of trade winds and ocean guyas, knowledge that made long-distance travel increasingly reliable. Italian ports, primarily oriented toward the Mediterranean, were less integrated into these Atlantic systems. While Italian sailors were skilled, their states were not investing in Atlantic infrastructure on the same scale. Another key factor was early institutionalization. Portugal established trading posts along the African coast and later in Asia. Spain quickly transitioned from exploration to conquest. After Columbus's voyages, Spanish expeditions followed rapidly. Hernan Cortes conquered the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro overthrew the Inca Empire. Spain did not merely explore, it occupied, administered, and extracted wealth. This required enormous coordination. Armies had to be transported, settlers relocated, colonial governments formed, churches built, trade networks reorganized around transatlantic routes. The Spanish crown developed systems to regulate colonial trade. collect taxes, and control migration. Such operations demanded centralized bureaucracy. Italy's political structure could not match that scale. Even if one city-state had attempted to claim overseas territory, defending it against Spain or Portugal would have required military power far beyond its individual capacity. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 further solidified Iberian dominance. Brokered with Papal support, this agreement divided newly discovered lands outside Europe between Spain and Portugal along an imaginary meridian. Though imperfectly enforced, it demonstrated confidence and authority. Two unified kingdoms negotiated global division. Italy was not present as a unified participant in this negotiation. This early division of territories meant that by the time other European powers such as England, France, and the Netherlands entered the colonial race, Spain and Portugal already held enormous claims. Timing in history matters. Spain and Portugal moved first. Their unity allowed rapid decision-making. Their geographic orientation supported experimentation. Their monarchies could absorb losses and fund repeated expeditions. Italy, divided and often distracted by internal rivalry and foreign invasions, could not respond with equal speed. The head start widened into dominance. Spanish silver from the Americas began flowing into Europe in massive quantities. Portuguese trade routes connected Europe directly with Africa, India, and eventually Brazil. Atlantic wealth reshaped European power structures. Military capacity expanded. Naval strength increased. Meanwhile, Italian states remained influential in banking, culture, and Mediterranean trade, but their relative position shifted. The center of global commerce moved westward. It is important to understand that this outcome was not inevitable. Had Italy been unified in the late 15th century, its maritime experience might have translated into Atlantic expansion, but political fragmentation delayed decisive action. When opportunity emerges in history, the ability to act quickly and collectively often determines success. Spain and Portugal possessed that ability. Italy did not. Thus, Spain and Portugal's head start was not merely about sailing earlier. It was about unity, geography, institutional commitment, and strategic vision. And once that head start became momentum, the race for the Americas was no longer open to all. It was already being won. Just 2 years after Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, a crisis erupted in Europe that would permanently weaken Italy's ability to compete overseas. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded the Italian peninsula. What followed was not a short campaign, it was decades of brutal conflict known as the Italian Wars. From 1494 to 1559, Italy became the primary battleground for Europe's most powerful monarchies, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. While Spain was building an empire across the Atlantic, Italy was fighting for survival at home. The invasion began when Charles VIII claimed the throne of Naples. French armies marched south through Italy with modern artillery and professional troops. Italian city-states, divided and suspicious of one another, struggled to respond collectively. Some formed alliances, others shifted sides. The balance of power constantly changed. Instead of uniting against foreign invasion, Italian states often invited outside powers to weaken local rivals. This pattern proved disastrous. France sought dominance in northern Italy. Spain intervened to counter French influence. The Holy Roman Empire entered the struggle to protect its own interests. Battles were fought in Milan, Naples, and beyond. Cities were sacked, economies disrupted, treasuries drained. One of the most devastating moments came in 1527 with the sack of Rome. Imperial troops looted the city, shocking Europe and symbolizing Italy's vulnerability. The very heart of Renaissance culture was attacked. The peninsula that had led Europe in art, banking, and intellectual life was now a war zone. War is expensive. Armies must be paid, fortifications built, mercenaries hired, supplies transported. Italian states relied heavily on condottieri mercenary commanders who fought for the highest bidder. Maintaining these forces consumed enormous resources. Money that might have financed ships and exploration instead funded defensive campaigns. Military insecurity also discouraged long-term planning. Colonization required stable governance and confidence in future returns. Investors needed assurance that their homeland was secure. Who would fund distant colonies if their own cities might be besieged next year? While Spain extracted silver from the Americas and expanded its global reach, it also gained influence within Italy itself. Spanish Habsburg power eventually dominated much of the peninsula. Naples, Milan, and other territories fell under Spanish control. This meant that even if Italian states had developed colonial ambitions later, they would have had to compete with Spain, not only overseas, but politically at home. The Italian wars reshaped Europe's power balance. By 1559, the Peace of Cotocombrosis confirmed Spanish dominance in Italy. France retreated from many claims. Spain emerged as Europe's leading imperial power. For Italy, however, the wars marked a turning point. Political independence weakened. Economic growth slowed. Cultural brilliance continued, but geopolitical influence declined. The peninsula that had once been a center of innovation now found itself subordinated to larger monarchies. This long period of warfare had another consequence. Strategic focus. Spanish leaders were thinking globally. Their military campaigns in Italy were only one part of a broader imperial system that included the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. Silver from the New World financed European wars. Colonies reinforced Spain's global standing. Italian states, by contrast, had no overseas wealth to support them. Their conflicts consumed internal resources without generating external expansion. It is difficult to build an empire when foreign armies march across your own territory. The Italian wars also discouraged cooperation among city-states. Alliances formed out of necessity, but mistrust remained strong. Each state sought survival first, advantage second. Collective national ambition, which would require unity, remained distant. Meanwhile, the Atlantic world expanded rapidly. Spanish conquistadors conquered vast empires in the Americas. Portuguese traders established networks in Africa, Asia, and Brazil. England and France began exploring their own opportunities. Italy was increasingly absent from these developments. The wars did more than drain finances. They drained confidence. Political instability created caution. Leaders prioritized short-term security over long-term speculation. Colonization seemed less urgent than defending borders. Imagine trying to invest in a distant frontier while your homeland is repeatedly invaded. The rational choice is survival. By the time the Italian wars ended in the mid-16th century, the window of early colonial opportunity had largely closed. Spain and Portugal had secured enormous territories. Their administrative systems were in place. Their fleets dominated Atlantic routes. Italy's political fragmentation had deepened, not diminished. The peninsula's fate had shifted from independent actor to contested prize. The tragedy is not that Italy lacked intelligence or maritime knowledge. It is that history's critical moment for expansion coincided with internal weakness and foreign invasion. Timing matters. While Spain and Portugal consolidated global empires, Italy endured half a century of warfare. In the age of exploration, stability enabled expansion. Instability ensured limitation. The Italian wars did not merely distract Italy from colonizing the Americas. They ensured that by the time peace returned, the race had already been decided. While Spain and Portugal looked west toward the unknown Atlantic, the Italian states looked south and east, toward something far more familiar, profitable, and reliable: the Mediterranean. For centuries before Columbus, the Mediterranean Sea had been the center of European commerce. It was not merely a body of water, it was a highway of wealth, culture, and power. Italian city-states had mastered this world. Their ships crossed its waters with precision. Their merchants negotiated in its ports with confidence. Their fortunes were built upon it. From Venice in the northeast to Genoa in the northwest, Italian prosperity depended on trade routes that linked Europe to the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. Spices from India, silks from China, precious metals and luxury goods from distant markets. These goods did not travel directly to northern Europe. They passed through Mediterranean networks, and Italian merchants stood at the center of that system. Venice was perhaps the greatest beneficiary. Positioned at the top of the Adriatic Sea, it developed powerful commercial agreements with the Byzantine Empire and later with the Ottoman Empire. Venetian merchants established trading colonies and warehouses throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The city's arsenal, one of the largest shipbuilding complexes in the world, could produce vessels at remarkable speed. Venice was not searching for new routes. It already controlled existing ones. Genoa, meanwhile, dominated parts of the western Mediterranean and the Black Sea trade. Genoese merchants were deeply embedded in commercial systems stretching from Spain to the Levant. They financed ventures, transported goods, and managed ports across Europe. The city's wealth flowed steadily from established networks. This system worked. Profits were predictable. Risks were known. Markets were understood. By contrast, the Atlantic Ocean represented uncertainty. Western voyages meant sailing into waters that Europeans had not systematically mapped. Storm patterns were less understood. Navigation required new techniques. Supplies would have to last longer. Returns were hypothetical. Two leaders in Venice or Genoa, the Atlantic may have seemed like a gamble, and unnecessary gamble at that. Economic logic plays a powerful role in shaping history. When a system generates consistent profit, leaders rarely abandon it for speculation. The Mediterranean economy had functioned successfully for centuries. Italian states had invested heavily in fleets, port facilities, diplomatic agreements, and merchant communities tailored to that environment. Reorienting toward the Atlantic would require not just ships, but a shift in mindset. Portugal, on the other hand, faced geographic limitations. It did not control major Mediterranean trade routes. Its Atlantic coastline naturally encouraged westward and southward exploration. Portuguese sailors gradually moved down the coast of Africa, seeking a direct route to Asian markets. Spain, positioned between the Atlantic and Mediterranean, could afford to experiment westward once internal unity was achieved. Italy's geography shaped its priorities. Most major Italian ports opened toward the Mediterranean. Venice faced east, Genoa faced southwest, but remained deeply connected to Mediterranean circuits. Florence, located inland, relied on nearby ports and banking rather than oceanic exploration. The Papal States maintained coastal access but prioritized political balance within Europe. Thus, while Iberian sailors refined Atlantic navigation, developing caravels, studying wind currents, mastering open ocean, sailing Italian fleets continued perfecting Mediterranean trade strategies. Another key factor was Ottoman expansion. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. Many historians argue that this event disrupted traditional trade routes and encouraged Europeans to seek alternative paths to Asia. For Spain and Portugal, this disruption provided motivation to find sea routes that bypassed Ottoman-controlled territories. For Venice, however, the strategy was different. Rather than abandon eastern trade, Venice negotiated with the Ottomans. Diplomatic agreements allowed commerce to continue, though under new conditions. Venetian leaders believed adaptation was more practical than abandonment. This choice reflects strategic calculation. Why invest enormous resources in an uncertain Atlantic route when negotiations could preserve profitable eastern trade? The decision was rational, but history would later reveal its limitations. As the 16th century progressed, the center of economic gravity began shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Silver from the Americas flowed into Spain. Sugar plantations transformed Caribbean islands. Transatlantic trade networks expanded rapidly. Northern European powers eventually joined the competition. Italian states, deeply rooted in Mediterranean systems, adjusted slowly. Their commercial mindset had been shaped by centuries of experience. Merchant families calculated risk carefully. Banking institutions preferred stable returns. Political leaders avoided ventures that could destabilize internal balances. Atlantic colonization required bold, centralized decision-making, something more characteristic of unified monarchies than competitive republics. It is important to emphasize that Italian sailors possessed the technical knowledge required for long-distance navigation. Maritime skill was not the issue. The issue was strategic orientation. Imagine a powerful company that dominates an established market. Its leaders see steady profit and strong infrastructure. Suddenly, a new emerging market appears, distant, uncertain, risky. Some competitors invest heavily in this new frontier. Others hesitate, trusting their proven system. If the frontier succeeds, the early investors gain enormous advantage. Italy trusted its proven system. Spain and Portugal gambled on the frontier. In the late 15th century, this difference was not obvious. Mediterranean trade remained profitable. Italian cities were among the wealthiest in Europe. The Renaissance flourished under that wealth. Architecture, art, science, and literature thrived. There was little sense of urgency to abandon success for uncertainty. But as decades passed, Atlantic trade grew exponentially. The discovery of vast lands and resources reshaped European economies. Colonial wealth funded armies, navies, and global influence. Iberian empires expanded dramatically. Italy remained economically significant, but its relative position declined. The focus on Mediterranean commerce was logical within its historical context. Italian states were acting rationally, according to centuries of experience. They prioritized stability over speculation. They chose negotiation over exploration. They preserved trade networks rather than seeking radical transformation. Yet history sometimes rewards those willing to shift direction at the right moment. By the time that Atlantic's importance became undeniable, Spain and Portugal had secured dominance. Later, England, France, and the Netherlands would challenge them. But Italy, still politically fragmented and economically tied to Mediterranean patterns, could not easily reposition itself. Thus, Mediterranean focus, once the foundation of Italian prosperity, became a constraint in the age of Atlantic empires. The sea that had made Italy powerful did not lead to the New World, and while Italian merchants counted profits in familiar ports, the Atlantic quietly reshaped the future of global power. One of the great ironies of history is this: Italy did not colonize the Americas, but Italians helped discover them. When we examine the early age of exploration, Italian names appear again and again. Skilled navigators, mapmakers, and merchants from the Italian peninsula played central roles in Atlantic expansion. Yet almost none sailed under an Italian banner. They sailed for Spain, they sailed for Portugal, they sailed for England. Why? Let us begin with the most famous example: Christopher Columbus. Born in Genoa, Columbus grew up in a maritime environment. Genoa was a powerful trading republic with centuries of seafaring experience. From a young age, Columbus was exposed to navigation, commerce, and the realities of Mediterranean trade. He developed an ambitious idea: reaching Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. But Genoa did not fund him. Columbus approached various courts seeking sponsorship. He spent years presenting his proposal. Eventually, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to finance his voyage. In 1492, Columbus crossed the Atlantic, not as an Italian representative, but as an agent of Spain. When he landed in the Caribbean, he claimed the territory for the Spanish crown. His discovery reshaped world history. It launched Spain into a vast imperial enterprise. Gold, silver, land, and power flowed back to Madrid. Yet the man at the center of it all was Genoese. Columbus's story reflects a larger pattern. Consider John Cabot, born Giovanni Caboto in Italy. Cabot sought support for a westward voyage and ultimately received backing from England. In 1497, sailing under the English flag, he reached parts of North America, likely Newfoundland. His voyage strengthened England's future claims in the New World. Again, an Italian navigator contributed to the expansion of another empire. Then, there is Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci participated in voyages along the South American coast under Spanish and Portuguese sponsorship. His letters describing the lands across the Atlantic suggested that these territories were not Asia, but an entirely new continent. It is from Vespucci's name that the word America is derived. The continent itself bears an Italian name, yet it was colonized primarily by Spain and Portugal. This paradox reveals something fundamental about political structure. Talent existed in Italy. Maritime knowledge flourished there. Italian navigators were respected across Europe. But exploration on the scale required for colonization demanded more than individual skill. It required state power. Ships had to be financed. Crews had to be recruited. Expeditions required long-term support. When new lands were discovered, armies and administrators had to follow. Colonies required sustained investment and protection. City-states could support merchants. They could back trade ventures. But sponsoring large, risky, multi-year, oceanic expeditions required centralized authority and deep national resources. Spain provided that. Portugal provided that. England, emerging later, would provide that. Italy, divided among competing states, did not. For an ambitious explorer born in Genoa or Florence, seeking foreign sponsorship was practical. Foreign monarchs could offer titles, wealth, and protection. They could promise noble status and hereditary privileges. Columbus, for instance, negotiated significant rewards from Spain, including titles and a share of profits from discovered lands. No single Italian city-state could match that level of backing without risking its own stability. There was also another factor: vision. Unified monarchies pursued exploration as part of national strategy. Spanish expansion combined religious motivation, economic ambition, and political prestige. Portuguese exploration was driven by a sustained royal commitment to maritime advancement. These were long-term projects integrated into state policy. Italian states, by contrast, operated within regional calculations. Venice prioritized maintaining trade with the Eastern Mediterranean. Florence focused on banking networks and political alliances. Milan concentrated on territorial security. Their horizons were not global in the same way. When Italian explorers left their homeland to sail under foreign flags, they were not betraying Italy, they were responding to opportunity. The structure that could support their ambitions existed elsewhere. This migration of talent had lasting consequences. Spanish America was shaped by Columbus's voyages. English claims in North America were strengthened by Cabot. Portuguese and Spanish mapping of South America incorporated Vespucci's insights. Italian knowledge became embedded in foreign empires. It is tempting to imagine an alternative history. What if Venice and Genoa had united? What if Florence had partnered with maritime states? What if a unified Italian monarchy had emerged in the late 15th century? Could an Italian empire have stretched across the Atlantic? The possibility was not impossible, but the political reality made it unlikely. Even after the first voyages, Italian states did not mobilize collectively to compete. Once Spain and Portugal established early dominance, agreements like the Treaty of Tordesillas divided much of the New World between them. The window for entry narrowed quickly. By the early 16th century, colonization required more than discovery. It required conquest. Spanish conquistadors overthrew empires in the Americas. Massive administrative systems developed. Military presence expanded. This scale of operation demanded national coordination. Individual explorers could discover lands. Empires required states. Italy produced discoverers, but not empire builders, at that moment in history. The legacy of Italian explorers reminds us that colonization was not simply about geography or navigation. It was about political organization. The Atlantic world was shaped by those who could transform voyages into sustained imperial systems. Columbus did not return to Genoa with a new continent for Italy. He returned to Spain. Cabot did not claim North America for Venice. He claimed it for England. Vespucci did not map the South American coast for Florence. He sailed under Iberian authority. Thus, the story of Italian explorers under foreign flags illustrates the central theme of this history. Fragmentation limited national ambition. Italy gave the age of exploration its navigators, but other nations gave them ships, flags, and empires. And in that partnership, unequal but decisive, the shape of the Americas was determined. While Spain and Portugal were carving out empires across oceans, the Italian peninsula was leading a different kind of revolution, one not of conquest, but of culture. This was the age of the Renaissance. The priorities of Italian states were shaped by what they valued most: prestige through culture, influence through finance, and power through diplomacy. In Florence, families like the Medici invested enormous sums in art and scholarship. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were supported by wealthy patrons who sought to immortalize their cities through beauty and innovation. Banking networks extended across Europe, influencing monarchies from afar. In Rome, the papacy channeled resources into grand construction projects and religious authority. St. Peter's Basilica rose as a symbol of spiritual power. The Church's influence stretched across continents, even into newly discovered lands, but through missionary activity rather than colonization by Italian states. Venice invested in naval defense of Mediterranean trade routes and in architectural grandeur that reflected its status as La Serenissima. Milan strengthened its fortifications and courtly culture. Everywhere, artistic brilliance flourished. This cultural explosion required funding. Art was expensive. Architecture demanded labor and materials. Universities required scholars and support. Patronage systems depended on steady financial investment. Italian elites poured resources into visible, immediate achievements that elevated their cities' reputations. Colonization, by contrast, was distant and uncertain. It required years of waiting before profits might appear. It required managing settlers, defending territory, and confronting unknown risks. Compared to commissioning a masterpiece that enhanced civic pride, funding an Atlantic expedition seemed speculative. There was also a philosophical dimension. The Renaissance emphasized humanism, a focus on classical learning, human potential, and intellectual achievement. Italian thinkers were rediscovering Greek and Roman texts, debating philosophy, advancing science, and refining artistic techniques. Energy flowed into intellectual rebirth rather than territorial conquest. Meanwhile, Spain and Portugal framed expansion in both economic and religious terms. Exploration was tied to spreading Christianity and competing with rival powers. The Atlantic became a theater of national mission. Italy's ambitions were different. Italian states were not passive or unaware of global change. Merchants understood shifting trade patterns. Bankers tracked international markets. But their response was gradual adaptation rather than radical transformation. Venice, for example, sought to maintain Eastern trade through negotiation with the Ottoman Empire. Florence expanded financial networks into Northern Europe. Italian influence remained strong but indirect. It is important to understand that during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Italy did not appear weak. On the contrary, it appeared vibrant and prosperous. Visitors from across Europe admired its cities. Its art set new standards. Its universities trained scholars. Its bankers financed kings. From the perspective of the time, investing in cultural supremacy seemed rational. No one in 1490 could fully predict how dramatically the Atlantic would reshape global economics. The Mediterranean had been Europe's commercial heart for centuries. To many Italian leaders, it still seemed central. History often reveals shifts only in hindsight. As Spanish ships returned with silver from the Americas, the balance of wealth began to tilt westward. Atlantic ports like Seville gained prominence. Later, Amsterdam and London would rise as financial centers. The axis of European power moved gradually away from the Mediterranean. Italy's Renaissance achievements ensured lasting cultural influence, but they did not translate into colonial dominance. There is also a deeper truth here. Societies cannot prioritize everything at once. Resources are finite. Attention is finite. Leadership must choose where to invest energy. Italian states chose culture, banking, diplomacy, and regional stability. Spain and Portugal chose expansion, conquest, and overseas empire. Neither choice was irrational, but one reshaped the global map. The Renaissance left Italy with enduring legacy: art, architecture, science, philosophy. The Atlantic empires left Spain and Portugal with vast territories and immense wealth, at least for a time. In the short term, Italy's focus on culture brought prestige. In the long term, the shift of economic power toward the Atlantic reduced Mediterranean dominance. It is tempting to ask, could Italy have done both? Perhaps, but only with unity and stability. Without national consolidation, coordinating a large-scale colonial project while maintaining internal rivalry and external defense was nearly impossible. Thus, while Iberian ships crossed oceans, Italian cities competed for artistic excellence. While conquistadors established colonies, Italian masters painted ceilings and sculpted marble that would inspire generations. The Renaissance made Italy immortal in culture, but it did not make Italy an Atlantic empire. In the age when oceanic expansion determined global power, Italy's greatest triumph, its cultural rebirth, was also, indirectly, a diversion from colonial ambition. History remembers both, yet the Americas would not speak Italian. They would speak Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French, because while Italy led Europe in art and thought, others led it across the sea. Geography does not determine destiny, but it strongly influences opportunity. When examining why Italy did not colonize the Americas, geography plays a quiet yet powerful role. The physical position of the Italian peninsula shaped trade routes, strategic thinking, and economic priorities for centuries. Italy stretches deep into the Mediterranean Sea. Its coastline is long, curved, and open primarily toward the east and south. Venice faces the Adriatic. Genoa faces the Ligurian Sea. Naples opens toward the central Mediterranean. These waters connected Italy to North Africa, the Byzantine world, and the Ottoman Empire. For generations, the Mediterranean was the center of European commerce. But the Atlantic Ocean was different. Portugal sits directly on the Atlantic coast. Its ports open westward into the vast ocean. Spain, especially after unification, had broad Atlantic access through ports like Seville and Cadiz. These locations, naturally, encouraged exploration westward and southward. Italian ports, by contrast, were not positioned for direct Atlantic dominance. Yes, Genoa had access through the Strait of Gibraltar, but that narrow passage was heavily influenced and later controlled by Iberian powers. To build an Atlantic empire, Italian fleets would have needed not only ships but consistent access to ocean routes dominated by Spain and Portugal. Geography affects psychology as well as logistics. Portuguese sailors became accustomed to Atlantic currents, wind systems, and long ocean voyages. Over decades, they learned to navigate the trade winds and return currents that made round-trip journeys possible. Spanish navigators built upon that knowledge. Italian maritime tradition, though highly advanced, was optimized for Mediterranean conditions. The Mediterranean is smaller, with different wind patterns and shorter distances between ports. Ships were designed primarily for regional trade and galley warfare, not for extended open ocean crossings. The Atlantic demanded innovation. Portugal invested heavily in developing the caravel and refining navigational tools, such as the astrolabe and improved cartography. These developments did not happen overnight. They were part of sustained state-supported experimentation. Italian states had the technical skill to adapt, but without unified political backing, large-scale Atlantic experimentation was limited. There was also the matter of scale. The Atlantic is vast and unpredictable. Storms are stronger. Distances are longer. Supply planning is more complex. Establishing colonies requires not just exploration but sustained transport across thousands of kilometers. Spain and Portugal built Atlantic-facing shipyards and naval bases dedicated to this purpose. Their economic orientation gradually shifted toward oceanic trade. Italy's economic infrastructure remained Mediterranean-centered. Another geographic factor was vulnerability. The Italian peninsula lies at the crossroads of Europe. It is accessible from the north through the Alps and from the sea on multiple sides. This made it wealthy but also exposed. Foreign invasions were common. The Italian wars demonstrated how easily external powers could project force into the peninsula. Spain and Portugal, by contrast, enjoyed relative geographic insulation. The Pyrenees Mountains provided a natural barrier between Iberia and the rest of Europe. Once internal unity was achieved, the Iberian kingdoms could focus outward rather than constantly defending their borders. Security enables expansion. Insecure states prioritize defense. Italy's central position in European politics made it a prize for competing powers. Its wealth attracted attention. Its division made it vulnerable. Geographic centrality meant that internal stability was fragile. Meanwhile, Iberian geography encouraged maritime focus, surrounded by the Atlantic on one side and relatively protected on land. Portugal especially could experiment outward with fewer immediate continental threats. It is also important to consider resource distribution. Colonization required timber for ships, access to open water ports, and dedicated naval infrastructure. Portugal's Atlantic coastline facilitated the construction of fleets designed specifically for oceanic travel. Spain invested in Atlantic ports that became hubs of colonial administration. Italian shipyards were advanced, but tailored to Mediterranean needs. Venice's arsenal was impressive, but its strategic objective was to dominate eastern trade, not cross the Atlantic repeatedly with settlers and supplies. Geography does not make colonization inevitable, but it shapes strategic focus. Italian leaders saw opportunity in maintaining dominance over Mediterranean trade networks. Iberian leaders saw opportunity in expanding beyond them. Over time, as the Atlantic economy grew, this geographic difference became more significant. Wealth shifted toward Atlantic ports. Cities like Seville, Lisbon, later Amsterdam and London, gained prominence. Mediterranean centers gradually lost relative influence. Had Italy unified earlier and intentionally reoriented its maritime strategy westward, geography alone would not have prevented colonization. But geography influenced priorities, and priorities influenced action. Consider this: if Venice or Genoa had committed to Atlantic exploration, they would have needed to establish reliable access to Atlantic bases. That might have required conflict with Iberian powers, or negotiation from a position of weakness. Such geopolitical complications further discouraged large-scale commitment. Thus, geography compounded fragmentation. Italy faced east and south, tied historically and economically to Mediterranean systems. Spain and Portugal faced west, toward the unknown. The Atlantic frontier was closer, physically and psychologically, to Iberia. When Columbus sailed west in 1492, he departed from Spain's Atlantic coast, not from an Italian port. The logistical simplicity of departure mattered. Supplies, crews, and royal oversight were centralized near the launching point. Italy's orientation meant that Atlantic ambition would have required greater structural change. In history, moments of transformation favor those already positioned at the edge of new frontiers. Portugal stood at the Atlantic's edge. Spain straddled two worlds. Italy remained rooted in the Mediterranean. Geography alone did not decide the outcome, but it nudged history in a particular direction, and as the Atlantic world expanded, Italy's Mediterranean advantage gradually became a strategic limitation. The sea that had enriched Italian cities for centuries did not lead directly to the Americas. And in the age when oceans determined empire, facing the right ocean mattered. While Spain and Portugal conquered territories across oceans, Italy mastered something else: finance. If colonization required ships, armies, and settlers, it also required money. And in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, some of the most powerful financial networks in Europe were Italian. Florence, in particular, became synonymous with banking innovation. Families such as the Medici built vast credit systems that stretched across Europe. Monarchs borrowed from Italian bankers to fund wars, royal courts, and even overseas expeditions. In a profound historical irony, Italian capital often helped finance the very empires that would dominate the Americas. Consider the structure of power at the time. Spain's imperial ventures were enormously expensive. Ships had to be constructed, soldiers equipped, administrators appointed, fortifications built in distant lands. Silver fleets required protection. Maintaining this system demanded continuous funding. Spanish monarchs frequently relied on loans, and who were among the lenders? Italian bankers. Rather than sending fleets westward under an Italian flag, financial elites in cities like Florence and Genoa extended credit to foreign crowns. This strategy offered several advantages. Lending money generated profit without the risks of colonization. Interest payments flowed back to Italian banks. Financial influence could be exercised without territorial responsibility. From a business perspective, it was efficient. Why assume the dangers of distant conquest when you can profit by financing those who do? This reflects a fundamental difference in strategic culture. Spain pursued glory, expansion, and religious mission alongside economic gain. Portugal sought maritime routes that would reshape trade patterns. Both kingdoms integrated empire into national identity. Italian states pursued leverage through commerce and credit. Financial sophistication allowed Italian elites to exert influence beyond their borders. Loans tied monarchies to banking houses. Economic dependency created diplomatic channels. The Medici, for example, gained political power not only within Florence but through connections with foreign courts. Banking became a tool of soft power at the same time. Colonization required long-term political commitment. Conquered lands had to be governed. Indigenous populations managed, often brutally. Trade monopolies enforced. Military threats repelled. Italian city-states, already managing complex regional rivalries, may have viewed such obligations as burdensome. There was also the matter of risk calculation. Banking risk could be diversified. Loans could be structured. Credit could be extended cautiously. Colonization risk was far less predictable. Storms could sink ships. Settlements could fail. Resistance could arise. Entire expeditions could vanish. Merchants and financiers prefer measured risk. Italian economic culture, refined over centuries of Mediterranean trade, emphasized contracts, calculation, and negotiated advantage. Atlantic colonization, particularly in its early stages, resembled speculation. Even when Italian merchants participated indirectly in Atlantic commerce, they often did so through partnerships with Iberian powers rather than as independent colonial actors. Genoese financiers, for instance, became deeply involved in managing Spanish imperial revenue. As silver from the Americas poured into Europe, Genoese bankers played key roles in credit systems tied to that wealth. Thus, Italian influence persisted, but invisibly. Italy did not rule American territories, but Italian money circulated within imperial systems. There is a deeper structural insight here. Colonization was not the only path to power in early modern Europe. Financial networks could shape outcomes without territorial control. Yet financial influence is different from sovereignty. Spain controlled mines in the Americas. Portugal controlled sugar plantations in Brazil. England would later dominate Atlantic trade routes. Territorial possession translated into geopolitical strength. Italy's banking dominance could not substitute for national empire. Moreover, reliance on foreign monarchies introduced vulnerability. When borrowers defaulted, as Spain occasionally did, financial crises followed. Economic dependence on foreign powers carried its own risks. As Atlantic wealth reshaped Europe, financial centers gradually shifted northward. Amsterdam and later London emerged as powerful banking hubs, tied directly to colonial trade. Italy's earlier financial advantage began to erode. Had Italy unified and integrated its banking expertise with maritime expansion, it might have combined capital with conquest, but fragmentation prevented such synthesis. City-states competed economically just as they competed politically. Banking families sought private gain rather than national imperial vision. Without unified coordination, financial strength remained compartmentalized. This distinction between financing empire and building empire is critical. Italy's economic elites were pragmatic. They understood markets. They maximized profit. In many cases, they benefited from Iberian expansion without bearing its costs. But history remembers empires more than financiers. When maps were drawn and territories claimed, flags marked sovereignty. Those flags were Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, not Italian. Italy chose consciously, or unconsciously, to remain a banker, rather than a conqueror during the formative decades of Atlantic expansion. And while banking produced wealth and influence, it did not produce colonies. Thus, in the calculus of early modern power, Italy traded imperial ambition for financial leverage. It was a rational decision within its political structure. But as the Atlantic world matured, territorial control proved decisive. In the end, lending two empires did not make Italy one. And the Americas would be shaped by those who governed them, not those who financed them. In the late 15th century, one of the most powerful institutions in Europe was located in Italy, the papacy. The Pope was not only a spiritual leader, but also a political ruler. The Papal States controlled large territories in central Italy. Rome was both a religious capital and a sovereign power. At first glance, this might suggest that Italy had an advantage in overseas expansion. After all, religion played a major role in colonization. Spain and Portugal justified their expansion partly as a mission to spread Christianity. But in reality, papal authority strengthened Iberian expansion rather than creating an independent Italian colonial project. In 1493, shortly after Columbus's first voyage, Pope Alexander VI issued papal bulls granting Spain rights over newly discovered lands west of a certain meridian. These decisions were later formalized in the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal. The Pope, based in Rome, effectively sanctioned the division of the non-European world between two Iberian kingdoms. This moment is revealing. The papacy did not claim those lands for the Papal States. It did not organize an Italian-led missionary empire. Instead, it endorsed Spanish and Portuguese authority, provided they spread Christianity. Why? Because the papacy's priority was religious expansion, not national Italian power. The Church viewed overseas exploration as an opportunity to convert new populations. Spain and Portugal, unified monarchies with strong military and naval capacity, were capable of carrying out that mission. Italian city-states, divided and politically unstable, were not. There was also a structural separation between religious authority and Italian nationalism. In the 15th and 16th centuries, there was no strong sense of Italian national identity. Loyalty was local to Venice, Florence, Milan or Naples, or spiritual to the Church. The papacy did not function as a national Italian government. It was a supranational institution with influence across Europe. Its interests were not limited to strengthening Italy as a political unit. Thus, when Spain promised to evangelize newly discovered territories, the papacy supported Spain. Missionaries from Italy did travel to the Americas. Priests, friars, and scholars participated in colonial religious life. Italian clergy influenced theological debates about indigenous rights and conversion methods, but these efforts operated within Spanish and Portuguese colonial systems. The Papal States themselves lacked the naval power and military infrastructure required for territorial conquest overseas. Their political resources were tied to maintaining influence within Italy and balancing European powers. Moreover, religious politics within Europe demanded attention. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century posed a massive challenge to Catholic authority. The Church devoted enormous energy to responding through the Counter-Reformation. Councils, reforms, and internal restructuring consumed institutional focus. Colonizing distant continents as an Italian-led enterprise was not the papacy's objective. Instead, the Church integrated itself into Iberian expansion. Spanish colonies became centers of missionary activity. Religious orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and later the Jesuits spread across the Americas. Italy's contribution was spiritual rather than territorial. There is also a subtle political dimension to consider. If the papacy had attempted to build its own colonial empire, it would have risked antagonizing Spain and Portugal, powerful Catholic monarchies whose support was crucial for maintaining church influence in Europe. Aligning with Iberian powers strengthened Catholic unity. Competing with them would have fractured it. Thus, religious alignment reinforced Iberian dominance. Italy's most influential institution endorsed others' expansion rather than initiating its own. This alignment also limited the possibility of coordinated Italian ambition. The Papal States were one among several political entities on the peninsula. Their priorities did not necessarily align with Venice's or Florence's interests. Instead of serving as a unifying national force, the papacy functioned as an independent power balancing regional dynamics. Religion fueled colonization, but not Italian colonization. Spain framed its empire as both economic and spiritual. Portugal did the same. Conversion efforts legitimized conquest in the eyes of European rulers. Italy, through the papacy, legitimized those conquests. The irony is striking. Rome, the center of Catholic authority, sanctioned the division of the Americas, yet Italy itself gained no colonies from that division. Spiritual influence flowed outward from Italy, political control did not. In the centuries that followed, missionaries from Italian regions continued to travel to the Americas. Scholars, theologians, and clergy left their mark on colonial society. But sovereignty remained firmly in Iberian hands. Thus, papal authority strengthened global Catholic expansion while reinforcing Italy's absence as a territorial empire. The Church shaped the moral framework of colonization. Spain and Portugal shaped its political reality. And in the age when empire required unity of church and crown under national direction, Italy's divided structure once again proved decisive. The Vatican blessed the ships, but they did not sail under an Italian flag. By the time Italy finally became a unified nation, the Atlantic world had already been transformed for centuries. The crucial decades of exploration and early colonization occurred between the late 15th and early 17th centuries. During that period, Spain and Portugal built vast empires in the Americas. England and France later established their own colonies. The Netherlands joined the competition. The Atlantic became the center of global trade. Italy, however, did not become a single nation-state until 1861. For more than 3 centuries after Columbus's voyage, the Italian peninsula remained politically fragmented or dominated by foreign powers. Spanish Habsburg rule influenced large portions of Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries. Later, Austrian control shaped northern regions. Napoleon's campaigns in the early 19th century briefly reorganized Italian territories, but did not produce lasting unity. The movement toward national unification, known as the Risorgimento, gained momentum in the mid-19th century. Figures such as Giuseppe Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel II played central roles in consolidating the peninsula into the Kingdom of Italy. But this unification occurred in 1861, nearly 370 years after Columbus crossed the Atlantic. By that time, the colonial map of the Americas was already firmly established. Spain had controlled vast territories in Central and South America for centuries. Portugal ruled Brazil. Britain had built colonies that eventually became the United States and Canada. France had influenced parts of North America and the Caribbean. The age of initial conquest was long over. Even the global context had changed. The 19th century marked a different phase of imperialism, often focused on Africa and Asia rather than the Americas. The United States had already declared independence from Britain in 1776. Many Latin American nations had achieved independence from Spain and Portugal in the early 19th century. The opportunity for European powers to carve out new American colonies was limited. Italy unified at a time when the colonial race had shifted elsewhere. There is an important structural lesson here. Colonization requires timing. It requires entering the competition early, when territories are unclaimed and rivals are few. Spain and Portugal moved during the first wave of Atlantic expansion. England and France joined in the second wave. By the time Italy emerged as a modern nation-state, the Atlantic system was mature. Moreover, newly unified Italy faced internal challenges. Unification did not instantly produce stability or wealth. The country had to integrate diverse regions with different economic levels, political traditions, and social structures. Infrastructure required development. Political institutions needed strengthening. Economic disparities between North and South demanded attention. Launching large-scale overseas colonization in the Americas would have required enormous resources and military strength, both of which Italy was still consolidating. Instead, Italy turned its colonial ambitions toward Africa in the late 19th century. Like other European powers during the scramble for Africa, Italy sought to establish colonies in Eritrea, Somalia, and later Libya. This was part of a new phase of imperial competition, different from the 16th century Atlantic conquests. By then, The Americas were largely independent nations or firmly controlled by established powers. Attempting to seize territory there would have meant confronting strong states, the United States in North America, independent republics in Latin America, and powerful European rivals. The global balance of power no longer favored latecomers in the Americas. There is also a psychological dimension. When Italy unified, it was seeking recognition as a modern European power. Its focus was on consolidating national identity, industrializing, and asserting itself within continental politics. The Americas were no longer an open frontier. They were part of an established global order. The contrast is striking. In 1492, Italy was divided but culturally dominant. In 1861, Italy was unified, but entering a world already shaped by centuries of Atlantic empire. Unification came, but too late to influence the initial formation of the new world. Had Italy unified in the 15th century, history might have unfolded differently. A centralized Italian monarchy could have combined maritime expertise, banking wealth, and geographic position to compete with Iberian powers. But history is not built on hypotheticals. Political fragmentation delayed unity. Foreign domination weakened sovereignty. Internal divisions postponed national consolidation. When Italy finally stood as one nation, the era of American colonization had passed. The window had closed. Italy would contribute to global history in many other ways through migration, culture, diplomacy, and later colonial ventures in Africa. Millions of Italians would migrate to the Americas in the 19th and early 20th centuries, shaping societies in the United States, Argentina, Brazil, and beyond. But migration is not colonization. Italian communities in the Americas arrived as immigrants within existing nations, not as representatives of an Italian empire. Thus, late unification sealed the outcome. The absence of unity in the 15th century prevented early entry into Atlantic expansion. The arrival of unity in the 19th century came after. The decisive centuries had already passed, and in the story of empire, timing is everything. Italy became a nation, but the Americas had already been claimed. By the late 19th century, Italy was finally unified. It had a king, it had a national army, it had a flag. For the first time in history, Italy possessed the political structure that earlier centuries had lacked. But the world had changed. The Atlantic age of discovery was over. The Americas were no longer open frontiers for European conquest. Independent nations now stood across North and South America. The United States had emerged as a rising power. Latin American republics had broken free from Spanish and Portuguese rule. If Italy wanted colonies, it would have to look elsewhere. And it did. In the late 1800s, European powers entered what historians called the scramble for Africa. Industrialization had increased the demand for raw materials, markets, and global influence. Britain and France expanded aggressively across the African continent. Germany, newly unified in 1871, joined the competition. Italy, eager to prove itself as a modern power, followed. Unlike Spain and Portugal in the 16th century, Italy was now a latecomer in a crowded imperial race. It did not have centuries of colonial infrastructure. It did not command a dominant navy. It did not possess vast overseas wealth. Still, it pursued empire. Italy established control over Eritrea in the 1880s. It expanded influence into parts of Somalia. In 1911, it invaded Libya, then part of the Ottoman Empire, seeking territorial expansion in North Africa. These efforts marked Italy's attempt to claim a place among imperial powers, but the contrast with earlier Iberian expansion is significant. Spain and Portugal had launched their colonial ventures when global competition was limited. Italy entered an era when the map was already divided among strong rivals. Resistance from local populations was fierce. International tensions were high. Italian imperial ambitions faced setbacks. In 1896, Italian forces suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Odwa in Ethiopia, a rare and powerful example of an African army successfully resisting European colonization. The loss was humiliating and revealed the limits of Italian military power at the time. Even when Italy did secure colonies, they were relatively small compared to the vast empires of Britain or France. And crucially, none were in the Americas. Why not attempt colonization there? Because by the late 19th century, the geopolitical environment made it nearly impossible. The United States had declared the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, warning European powers against further colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Latin American nations guarded their sovereignty. European empires had already staked claims in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Any Italian attempt to seize territory in the Americas would likely have triggered major international conflict, something the young Italian state was not prepared to face. Instead of colonizing the Americas, Italy's connection to the New World took a different form: migration. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Italians emigrated to the Americas. They settled in the United States, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, and beyond. Italian communities became integral parts of these societies. This migration reshaped cultures, economies, and cities. But again, migration is not empire. Italian immigrants built neighborhoods, businesses, and families. They integrated into existing nations. They did not plant an Italian flag over new territories. The absence of Italian colonies in the Americas was not due to lack of ambition in the 19th century. It was due to timing and structural limitations in the 15th and 16th centuries. When colonization mattered most in shaping the New World, Italy was divided. When Italy finally unified, the New World had already been shaped. This final chapter reveals a powerful historical lesson. Empire is not only about capability, it is about unity. It is about timing. It is about entering the competition when opportunity is still open. Italy eventually sought empire, but in a world where the rules had changed. The Americas spoke Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French. Italian influence would arrive through culture, cuisine, art, architecture, and immigration, not through conquest. Thus the story comes full circle. Italy did not colonize the Americas, not because it lacked explorers, talent, or ambition. It lacked unity at the decisive moment. And by the time unity came, the age of Atlantic empire had already written its history. The ships had sailed, the flags had been planted, the map had been drawn, and Italy, though influential in many ways, would remain absent from the colonial story of the Americas.